Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and this week we're going to be once again diving back into the exploits of Chicago's finest with The Savage Dragon #4. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. Before we get started today, I would like to start off by paying my respects to one Mr. Sam Keith. I just learned of his passing right before I started recording this video, and I'm very saddened by it. Any of you who have been watching my channel for any length of time know that The Max is indeed one of my favorite comic book series, and I believe very much so that Sam was one of the most unique artists and creators in the last 40 years of comic books. And to know that he's no longer with us and that we're never going to see anything new created by him again is unfortunate. As one of the guys who founded Image Comics, he's very much a big reason as to why I even started doing this channel in the first place. And, it is one of those situations where I feel as though I'm kind of standing on the shoulders of giants, for whatever you think about Image Comics or whatever you believe they may have done good or bad. The reality is that they changed the entire comic book industry from what it had been. Six guys with an idea and a dream got together and decided to change all of American comic book history going forward. And one of those men is now no longer with us, and I'm sad to know that. But getting back into what I do here every week and talking about comics, we'll start talking about this comic. The Savage Dragon #4, first published in September of 1993. We got a cover here featuring the dragon, Dart, and Barbaric in a police uniform, which is not so much foreshadowing as it is a straight up spoiler. And you'll see what I mean once we get inside of this book. Creator, writer, penciler, inker, Squeaky Larson. Letterer, Squeaky Eliopoulos. Colorist, Squeaky Olive, Squeaky Rude, Squeaky Cole. Editor, Squeaky Wong. Color separators, Squeaky Mouton, Squeaky Anderson. Emryotic Squeaky, Squeaky Mobert, Squeaky Leah, Squeaky Zendel, Squeaky Suppley, Squeaky Stratton Jordan, Squeaky Jordan, Squeaky Bine, Squeaky Ennis, Squeaky, and Elioptics. I don't know. I don't know. I really don't. I wish I had an explanation for what the hell that just was, but I don't. So take it for what it is. The story begins in the home that we have been seeing in the past several issues in Dekalb, Illinois, and I don't know if I'm saying that word right. The name of the town is Dekalb. I don't know if that's a real place in Illinois, and if it is, and you live there or have been there before, and I'm not saying that right, please, by all means, go into the comments section and write out phonetically the way I'm supposed to say the name of this town, because I'd really like to know. Savage Dragon has arrived at the request of the local police force, who have come across a grisly scene where two people seemingly have taken their own lives and are rotting in their own kitchen. However, the reason that the dragon was called in is because there is apparently a freak, a monster down in the basement, and the local PD does not believe that they are equipped to take on this creature on their own. So they've called for the help of none other than the Savage Dragon to come in and take care of this for them. Dragon says that he'll take care of it and immediately opens the basement door. And this kind of shocks the officer who seems to be in charge of the scene, as he's like, holy crap, you're just going to go right down there? And Dragon, of course, is fearless, as he is most of the time in these situations, as he simply opens the door stern-faced, ready to face whatever is downstairs. As Dragon begins to descend the staircase into the basement, we see that the creature described by the local police force is some sort of lizard-like monster covered in spines who is chained up to a nearby sink as a TV plays endlessly in the background. As Dragon reaches the bottom of the stairs, he realizes that things are not exactly the way that the police described them to him. He notices that the quote-unquote monster is in fact a little girl and that she's not doing so hot and is literally in no position to hurt anyone. He grabs the chain connecting her ankle to the sink and breaks it in half. As the police call down and ask him what it is, he yells back at them, rather irritated, that it is in fact a little girl, not some monster, and that she's been chained up down here for a really long time by the looks of it and is in no position to hurt anyone. He then tells them that she's starving and that he plans to help her as he wraps her in a blanket and proceeds to leave the home with her. We are then teleported back to the city of Chicago, where we see Lieutenant Darling and his wife leaving the emergency room. She was taken there after she fell down an escalator at the mall, claiming that someone inadvertently knocked into her and accidentally pushed her down said escalator, which caused her to break her ankle, as we see she's on a crutch and has a cast. Lieutenant Darling, however, is not so certain that this was just a chance occurrence and is worried that this is in fact the work of the vicious circle. He continues to berate his wife to make sure that she's okay, that their unborn baby is okay, and she continues to reassure him that everything is fine, but she seems to believe that he's acting a little too concerned and asks him what exactly is wrong and what exactly is eating him. However, before he can give her any kind of a deeper answer, their conversation is interrupted by none other than Dart, as Dart is also in the hospital getting patched up from the wounds that she sustained trying to stop the prison break in the previous issue. We see that Dart is rather enthusiastic about being the newest member of the Chicago PD, as she instantly walks up and introduces herself to Lieutenant Darling, stating her name and telling him that she is part of their new superhero division and looks forward to working with him in the future. We are then teleported to the police department, where the lizard girl, who is being referred to now as Horridus, has seemingly made a near full recovery as she eats a plate of chicken and exclaims, "Finger licking good." Now, this is important to note because since Horridus has been chained up seemingly her entire life in a basement with nothing to keep her company but a television, she basically speaks only in catchphrases that she's seen on commercials, television shows, and movies, meaning that nearly all of her dialogue are pop culture references and remain that way for the foreseeable future. Dragon is rather impressed by how quickly she's recovered, as is Captain Stewart. However, Captain Stewart is more seemingly concerned about enlisting her on the superhero team that he's putting together on the police force, more so than he is about her actual well-being. However, Dragon is not so certain about this, but Captain Stewart says why not? She's a blank slate. She'd be perfect for this team that we're putting together. At this point, Dragon lets Captain Stewart know that he is not on board with this and tells him that this is wrong. Captain Stewart then begins to backpedal a bit, stating, well, of course we would only do this with her own permission. However, you do know for a fact that we can be very persuasive. Dragon then leaves the room and goes back to his desk. However, upon sitting down, he is immediately approached by a beautiful redheaded woman, basically just screaming as she professes her love for him, stating, why don't you like me? Why are you avoiding me? And Dragon tells her, listen, Amanda, who, by the way, is this woman's name, I saved your life, and that's seemingly the only reason you're interested in me. He then tries to be very nice to her and gentle with her, stating that he saves lots of people's lives. That's part of his job as a police officer. And that, he did this because it's his job, not because he was looking for any kind of a relationship. However, Amanda seems to be very persistent as she states, yes, but we could try. I'm willing to try. And Dragon then tells her that, he doesn't want a woman who's only interested in him because he saved her life. This whole damsel in distress fawning over him as a knight in shining armor, as it were. That's not what he's looking for. And she again tries to argue the fact that she wants to be with him, but then Dragon stands up and lets her know that the last woman he was involved with wound up with a bullet in her brain. Of course, this is Debbie, the woman that he had a one-night stand with. He then tells her that he's in a dangerous line of work, and that means that vicious thugs are always trying to kill him and the people around him, and that with all the trouble he went through to save her, he'd rather that she didn't wind up dead as a result of being near him. He then tells her that this is the way things have to be. And at this point, Amanda seems to finally accept defeat, but is very saddened and says, yes, well, they don't have to be. Some things are worth fighting for, as she hangs her head and leaves. Now, I'm not 100% certain, but I believe that Amanda is the woman from the end of the first issue of the Savage Dragon miniseries that Dragon saved from the hostage situation, where she was in a house with a group of armed thugs when we also got our first introduction to Star. Again, it's not explicitly stated that she is that same woman, but she looks very similar to that woman, so I believe that she is, though I could be wrong. Just take it with a grain of salt. Later on, we see Captain Stewart talking to both Dragon and Dart, telling them both that this Super Freak team that he's putting together on the police department is coming along nicely, as Horridus has in fact decided to join the PD and is immediately going through the academy. However, he tells them both that it's going to take more than just 3 and that he needs to enlist some more Super Freaks. He tells them that he believes Star might be a good addition, and also asks Dart if she has any way of contacting Mighty Man. Dart says no, and Dragon says, well, you could try the psychic hotline, and this only makes Dart angry, as she and Dragon still are not getting along. However, Captain Stewart didn't exactly find this remark amusing either, and asks Dragon if he has any bright ideas. Dragon then brings up the 2 Super Freaks he met in the underground a couple of months ago, this of course being in reference to both Barbaric and Ricochet, when suddenly another officer runs up and tells them that there's some kind of problem in the underground right now with some Super Freaks going at it. Dart looks back at Dragon and states, you've set this up, didn't you? And Dragon denies that he had any knowledge of this going on. As the 2 of them run towards the underground, Dart scolds Dragon for not bringing any heavy artillery, and he responds by telling her that I didn't bring a sweater or my galoshes either, Mom. When suddenly the 2 of them hear a cry for help and burst through the underground, Dragon telling Dart to follow his lead. However, Dart telling Dragon that she knows exactly what she's doing and doesn't need to take orders from anyone. We then see Dragon scream, well, if you know what to do, then do it, as he jumps forward and tries to attack the large, bulbous, pustule-covered, gross, disgusting blob man that is currently trying to strangle Ricochet as Barbaric desperately tries to free her. Dart seems to be rather taken back by the situation at hand and is really shocked at what she's looking at. Not surprisingly, as this isn't something you see every day, folks. It's at this point that the disgusting blob man, who refers to himself as Cesspool, swipes Barbaric away with a single motion. However, this leaves him open to a punch from Savage Dragon. Unfortunately, Dragon's punch has basically no effect on him, as he counters with his own corrosive acid attack. Thankfully for Dragon, he is essentially burn-proof, so the acid has no real damaging effect on him. It more or less just grosses him out. It's at this point that Dart decides to get into the fray, as she tells Cesspool to give it up. She then unleashes a barrage of darts which stick into him. However, Cesspool simply laughs and tells her that she's going to have to do a lot better than that if she wants to stop him, as her darts have no effect. He then drops Ricochet and lunges towards Dart, who continues to pepper him with her darts, and tells her that he's going to make an example out of her and that she's dead, as he prepares to unleash a powerful attack. However, before he can get his attack off, we see Cesspool suddenly freeze as his eyes turn red and his head begins to swell. We then see all of the pores on his body erupt in a sea of acid and pus as the darts that he was being hit with apparently did something to him, but it's not really explained what. He then falls to the ground in defeat in a pool of his own disgusting filth, shrunken back down to the size of a normal man. It's at this point that Barbaric rushes to the aid of Ricochet, making sure that she's okay, and Dart takes the opportunity to mock Dragon, stating, "Wow, you were really impressive out there. I was glad I could learn such amazing techniques." Dragon responds by telling her to shut up, and then immediately goes over to talk to Barbaric and Ricochet, telling them of the program that the Chicago PD is currently doing where they want to enlist superpowered beings. Barbaric thinks that this would be cool, but doesn't believe that it's necessarily the right decision and begins to turn him down. However, Ricochet grabs him by the hair and pulls him down to her level, where she whispers to him that they can't hide forever and that they're going to do better if they're part of a group, especially if that group is the cops. At this point, Barbaric decides that Ricochet has the right idea and tells Dragon that they're in. Dragon, Dart, Ricochet, and Barbaric then all go back to the police station as we see Dragon booking Cesspool. Captain Stewart then shakes the hand of Barbaric and welcomes both him and Ricochet to the Chicago PD and is overjoyed that they're going to be joining up. We then see Cesspool try to talk big as he's being booked, stating that there was undue violence put upon him during his arrest and that he's going to sue. However, Dragon basically tells him to shut up and tell it to the judge. Captain Stewart then asks one simple question of both Barbaric and Ricochet, and that question is, how old are you exactly? And it's at this point we see that that question doesn't sit well at all with Ricochet. Ricochet immediately turns and storms off, stating, "I know when I wanted, and if you want to hang out with these jerks, you can, but I'm gonna leave and I'll be back for dinner." Barbaric seems rather stunned by this as he simply says, "Baby, oh, come on," as she runs out the door and bounces off of the stoop of the police station, stating, "I'll be back at 8. At this point, Dragon grabs Barbaric by the shoulder and tells him, "Don't worry, she'll cool off." And Barbaric is just kind of like dumbfounded by the whole thing and just says, "Oh, crap." And I want to point out, I don't think it's been expressed before now that Barbaric and Ricochet are in a romantic dating relationship, but they are in fact boyfriend and girlfriend. We are then suddenly teleported to a random bus where a man asks an elderly woman if the seat next to her is taken. She says that it's not, and then asks if he's also going to Chicago. The man says yes, and the elderly woman says, "Oh, that's wonderful. I'm going there too to see my son. I haven't seen him in a very long time," as we see the bus speed off towards the Windy City. We then see the Finn Addicts letter section, but it's upside down, and there's a very good reason for that. That reason being that this issue also features a secondary story with Ricochet and the brand new character Rapture. And this is actually a really cool way to introduce Rapture in her first appearance, as you'll see once we get inside. Creator, writer, Eric Larson. Penciler, Adam Hughes. Inker, Carl Kessel. Letterer, Chris Eliopoulos. Colorist, Steve Oliff, Antonia Cole. Editor, Janny Wong. Film output, Tony Kelly and Kello Graphics. Hired goon, Josh Eichorn, I'm not exactly sure how to say your name, Josh. I apologize. The story starts out with Ricochet hanging from a fire escape as she watches the superpowered being Rapture, who is making her first appearance, take on her former pimp. Now, Rapture is a former prostitute herself, and she witnessed her former pimp kill one of the other prostitutes that worked for him, and is now out for revenge after gaining lightning-based superpowers, as she is none too happy about the fact that he decided to murder a friend of hers and wants to make him pay for this crime. It's at this point that Ricochet decides to intervene as she jumps down and screams at Rapture to stop and allow the police to handle him. However, Rapture is not amused by Ricochet at all and tells her to scram. The pimp, whose name is Brian, begs Rapture not to harm him. However, Rapture states that she's done taking orders from him and that it's his time to die. Once again, Ricochet screams don't as Rapture turns around and unleashes an attack, telling her once again to get lost. But as Ricochet flies through the air in Rapture's direction, she apologizes, stating, "Sorry, lady, but I can't just sit back and let you murder someone in cold blood," as she connects with an attack that kicks Rapture square in the back. However, Rapture then turns around once again and unleashes an even more powerful attack in Ricochet's direction, which she once again evades. However, the attack causes a bright explosion that makes Brian shield his eyes from the light. At this point, Ricochet decides to make another attack as she leaps from the fire escape once again and grabs Rapture by the throat with her ankles. She then uses her momentum to flip Rapture off of her feet and slam her into the ground in one motion. Unfortunately, at this point, Ricochet is actually a little bit worried that she hurt Rapture much worse than she meant to, as she stands over her asking if she's okay and that she didn't mean to really harm her. However, this was just Rapture playing possum as she unleashes a powerful electric attack on Ricochet, which sends her flying through the air. We then see Rapture get back to her feet, trying to get her bearings, as she basically calls Ricochet stupid for not understanding what was happening. She then turns in an attempt to finish what she had started. However, she is quite shocked when she sees that Brian is back on his feet and has a gun pointed directly at her face. Rapture simply says, "You wouldn't," but we see that Brian is shaking profusely and says, "Oh really, I wouldn't? Why not? You were about to kill me, why wouldn't I do the same to you?" He then fires his gun. However, in his nervous state, he is very much off target and simply grazes Rapture's arm. Rapture then unleashes an attack at his feet, which sends him flying through the air, as we see Ricochet trying to get her own bearings and get back into the fight, and Rapture slowly approaching the dazed Brian. Ricochet calls out, screaming, "Don't, lady, please, you don't have to do this. Don't throw your life away on him, he's not worth it." However, Rapture turns back to Ricochet and states, "You don't understand what this man has done. He's killed people before and he'll do it again unless I stop him right here, right now. I can't let him live," as we see her charge up another attack, preparing to end the life of her former pimp, Brian. Ricochet grabs onto Rapture's arms in an attempt to stop her. However, Rapture unleashes a powerful electrical attack that encompasses her entire body. This attack once again knocks Ricochet back onto the ground, and in a desperate attempt, Ricochet pulls up her goggles and simply screams out to Rapture, "You think I'm just some stupid kid, but I know exactly what it's like to make a foolhardy decision that ruins your entire life. Are you willing to make that decision right now? Are you willing to spend the rest of your life on the run from the law? Are you willing to face jail time? Are you willing to kill me to get rid of any witnesses? Is this all the stuff that you're willing to do simply to get revenge on someone? To throw away your entire life for this one piece of crap?" And then basically tells her, like, you've got to make a decision right here, right now, as to what type of person you're going to be. At this point, Rapture realizes that Ricochet's correct, and she says, "You're right, kid, he's not worth it." Ricochet then gets back to her feet and states that they can grab this guy and drag him to the police station, and that she'll introduce Rapture to her boyfriend and the dragon and Dart, and that they're all pretty cool. Unfortunately, during this conversation, neither one of them are paying much attention to Brian, who has once again grabbed his gun as he leaps to his feet and says, "Stupid move, you're dead." Rapture puts up her hand in an attempt to get off an attack, as we see Ricochet jump forward screaming, "Look out," as Brian pulls the trigger and releases a final shot. Thankfully for Rapture, Brian seemingly has even worse aim than a stormtrooper, as he once again misses her from mere feet away. This gives Rapture the opportunity to unleash her own counterattack, which vaporizes Brian's head. However, Ricochet was caught off guard by this as she flies through the air trying to tackle him, and unfortunately, she lands upon his now decapitated corpse. Well, I don't know, can you call it a decapitation? He didn't get his head cut off, it just got destroyed completely. This is something that Ricochet was not counting on having to look at and is completely shocked when she sees the smoldering stump that now sits upon Brian's shoulders. She then screams out, "Oh my God, you actually killed him. This is so gross. He doesn't have a head. I'm gonna throw up." And then states, "You probably just saved my life." And at this point, Rapture puts her arm around Ricochet and simply states, "You know what, kid? I have no regrets," as we reach the end of the story. We then get an advertisement for Freak Force #1. As I've stated before when seeing this ad, I do have every issue of Freak Force, and when we get to the point where Freak Force splits off into its own ongoing monthly series, I will be making episodes about it, so stay tuned for that in the future. We then see an advertisement for Vanguard. If you'd like to know more about Vanguard, you can check out my episode on Vanguard #1. And we also get an advertisement for Super Patriot #4. Now, if you've been keeping up with the channel for any length of time, you know that I am a massive Super Patriot fan, and in fact, just put up an episode last week on Super Patriot #3, and will be making one on Super Patriot #4 in the not too distant future, so stay tuned for that. We then get an advertisement for the debate between Peter David and Todd McFarlane. We've come across this before. Essentially, this was a debate where Peter David was arguing that you needed writers and artists, not just artists writing their own stories. And Todd kind of, as far as I've been made aware, lost this debate handily because he didn't take it seriously in any way. And Peter David came in with actual strong arguments and points. Now, that being said, 30 years later, Todd's doing just fine. I don't think him losing this debate had any negative effect on his career path. So how important was it? I don't know. That's completely up for debate itself. Then we reach the letter section, Fin Addicts. And there were actually quite a few interesting letters in this one. Two of which had to do with the character contest that Eric Larson had going on. He had started a contest where people could submit a drawing and a brief overview of a character that they were creating originally. And if they won the contest, not only would they keep ownership of that character, but Eric would feature that character in an issue of Savage Dragon. And one guy felt like the entire contest was kind of rigged, as he basically got his entry returned to him within 8 days. And he felt like Eric and the gang didn't really look at the submission at all. And he was really rude in the way that he wrote this letter, just a real jerk the whole time. And, Eric explained in his response about how basically any character they got, they immediately decided if it was going to go into like the finalist pile. And if it was one that they didn't feel was something that grabbed their attention, they just immediately returned it. But like I said, this guy was a complete ass in the way that he even wrote this letter. At one point, he even made fun of Eric's house having recently burnt down, which is just completely classless. And, shout out to Eric. He took it in stride and took the high road and basically was like, "Hey man, that one was just kind of below the belt." And that was about as mean as he got in the response. So, full kudos to Eric Larson for taking the high road. And another reader basically accused Eric of stealing his character and using it and not giving him credit because his character was similar to the one that Eric had in the comic. And Eric explains in that one that the character he used in the comic was based off of one he had drawn 20 years prior. And that was one of the things he was really most concerned about with that contest to begin with, was that people would submit these characters, not win the contest, and then accuse him of stealing their work, which he didn't do. But, that is kind of the danger of having one of these contests, is that people will potentially make those connections, which is one of the reasons he considered never even doing it in the first place. Another reader brought up the fact that they really hoped that Eric was not considering a Savage Dragon movie, as they believed that if at any point they tried to make a movie based on this property, it would basically just kind of ruin everything. And I kind of understand where they're coming from, simply because of the fact that Savage Dragon is such a slow burn story that if you tried to cram all of that into a 90-minute story arc, it probably wouldn't really work. And, you know, in the early 90s, when this book was coming out, superhero movies were kind of on this weird trajectory. You know, you had Batman 89 and Batman Returns, which were both phenomenal, but then, you know, the Batman franchise kind of started to go downhill a little bit. The Superman movies were always kind of a mixed bag. You know, some of them were really good, some of them not so good. And it was easy for anyone seeing these films to make the connection that, you know, you were really rolling the dice making a superhero movie. And maybe it would be really good, but it also had the potential to be really, really bad. And given the fact that Savage Dragon was a really new property at this point, that had only been around for like a year in the, you know, pop culture landscape of comic books, it could have been devastating if a movie had been made and gone south. So the fear that this reader has is very understandable. Not that it really mattered, because Eric was at no point considering a Savage Dragon movie, even though he had gotten a few offers at this point. And obviously we know now in the future that one never got made, so the entire point of that letter was moot. And the last letter that really caught my eye, and this one really brings up some interesting points, is that one reader brings up the idea that he feels that Dragon's depression about Debbie being killed was really too much of a central focus. And his logic isn't completely off base. Keep in mind, Dragon had only known Debbie for like about 10 hours when she died. So the idea that her death would weigh so heavily on him does seem like it might be a little bit out of place. You know, it's not the same as like Bruce Wayne's parents getting killed in front of him. Those are his parents. He had spent his entire life knowing them. Whereas, you know, Debbie was basically an acquaintance to Dragon who he had just happened to sleep with one night. And, you know, he also brings up the point that all in all, Debbie had only existed in the book for roughly like 8 panels in total, or 8 pages in total. So it wasn't even like we, the readers, had a chance to ever develop a connection with her either, which made it harder for us to really, you know, buy the idea of Dragon's motivation being driven from Debbie's death. Now, I understand where he's coming from with that logic, and some of his points make a lot of sense. Though, I would point out that seeing someone murdered in the doorway to his apartment would probably have a very profound effect on Dragon, despite him not necessarily being head over heels in love with Debbie. You know, it is reasonable that this would be something that would be a major motivation for his character arc going forward, especially given all of the mental anguish that he was put through by Debbie's mother after her death. So while I can understand where he's coming from, I also can see where Eric would use this in the story the way that he did. Though I do agree that for Debbie's death to have more meaning for us, the reader, she should have been featured more prominently within the pages of Savage Dragon before her death. And that was Savage Dragon number 4. And overall, I think it was a really great book. Super good way to introduce Rapture as a new character, especially making it play directly off of the ending of the main story. I don't really have any complaints about this. I like the way that things ran with us finally getting an answer to what was going on in the basement in Dekalb, the introduction of Horridus, this being her first appearance as well. The only real complaints I have about this issue is that if Amanda is in fact the woman that Dragon rescued in the first issue of the miniseries, I feel like that should have been more explicitly stated, and it would have made that whole interaction between her and Dragon make more sense. And also, when Ricochet storms out of the police department after being asked her age, the idea behind that, I believe, is to imply that she's actually not 18 yet and therefore can't legally sign up to join the police department. But it's not explicitly stated in that instance either. So we're just kind of led to the point where we have to just kind of assume that's what's going on. And again, it probably is, but I feel like that should have been, a little bit more fleshed out when it happened. But then again, these are just my opinions. You may not have a problem with the way that was done. You may not have a problem with the whole interaction between Dragon and Amanda, and might think that Amanda's character isn't really important enough to warrant that kind of explanation. And you know what? If that's the case, it's okay, because everyone's entitled to their own opinions. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.